Thanks a lot, firstly, for coming in. Joining in today afternoon. My name's Hirsch, and I'll be taking you through the webinar on the AI data licensing sort of market and how to go about thinking about it. Um, the way we have structured this today, think of it as an introductory sort of webinar where we want to kind of introduce some of the key sort of concepts that are there at the moment, with the intention that this is going to be the first of multiple sort of webinars in a multi-part series where we kind of go deep dive into each of these sorts of key areas that we will be discussing. Right, so I'll start off with briefly talking about what we will be kind of discussing. So firstly, we'll be talking about data and AI, or rather, how do you go about thinking about your content and your data being used in AI? And this will be, you could say, a sort of key sort of theme that we use across the entire sort of presentation. With that, we'll kind of motivate what the current landscape is that we know of, and we'll talk about some of the licensing deals, compare how they've been structured, and also kind of work our way into how they're being used in sort of products that we see. And then we'll briefly touch upon valuation. What we've realized, especially with a lot of the publishers and content platforms out there, is they don't know how to think about kind of figuring out how to do some sort of valuation of their content. So what we'll do is kind of introduce some concepts that we use, and then how to actually go about repackaging this and kind of doing the distribution of the content. And finally, we'll conclude by some sort of compensation models out there that we've seen. We'll discuss them, what they mean, and how to go about thinking about them as well. And then, time permitting, we'll take some questions as well. So I believe there's a question sort of option. Feel free to kind of drop in some questions and we'll kind of go through those. Right. So the sort of key objectives of this webinar, well, as I mentioned, it's meant to be very informative, and the expected sort of audience here is mainly sort of content providers or sort of individuals thinking about, hey, I want to better understand what does content licensing mean or kind of data licensing mean. So that's the sort of objective here, help you inform and understand this sort of space, what to think about when it comes to valuation, distribution, compensation. And like I said, we want to kind of make this a multi-part series. So if you guys have any sort of suggestions, which area should we cover next, drop that in a sort of in the question tab, and we'll kind of take that in and kind of make that an objective of the sort of next sort of set of webinars as well. Right, so before I begin, I'll briefly kind of give you a bit of a background about us, about the company and some of the work that we're doing. So we're Valyu, and essentially we help rights holders such as publishers, content platforms. We help them license and distribute their content to AI companies. And we, as founders, we sort of believe that the way content is being consumed and distributed is changing. It moved from, you could say, print and film, it moved into the web, and we strongly believe that it's now moving into, you could say, AI sort of models and context windows. So it's a new sort of platform shift in distribution, and how we think about monetizing this, or what the economics look like, or how people go about working with this needs to sort of needs to reflect this new sort of paradigm. And that's essentially what we are doing as a company, helping publishers kind of on this journey. We're increasingly research led. In fact, still do a lot of research work on a part-time basis at UCL. I lead a lot of the research work in data, sort of evaluation, programmatic consent, and sort of its use in machine learning. Got a research group there, and do a lot of first principles research work. Most people may or may not be aware, but UCL is, you could say, where the likes of DeepMind have come from. So the same sort of research labs, also techniques such as retrieval augmented generation, which we'll go into a bit more detail as well. So the department in UCL, well, at least the computer science department in UCL is, you could say, very sort of instrumental in this sort of machine learning space, and just being exposed to that helps us kind of be a lot more, you could say, in the know about this ecosystem. And as you may be aware, it's moving at an incredible pace. As for my sort of personal background, it's in machine learning, data valuation, and I ended up kind of commercializing some of this work as well. Right. So without further ado, I'll kind of get into it. So data and AI. The intention of this segment is to help you understand how us or how AI developers really think about data and its use in AI or machine learning. And you could say there's two camps in this. So the first camp is for model training, and that's I'm sure the one that most people are aware of because it's often in the news more so than the other category, which we'll talk about next, which is context enrichment. The one thing you should note is that this is kind of grounded in how a model is trained and then used in applications. So as an AI developer, I start off with training a model. When I'm training something like a large language model or a vision model, I need to kind of the first thing I need to do is expose it to as much data as possible. And this process of exposing it to as much data as possible is what we call pre-training. And this is the one that you might have seen in the news. It's the process that takes months to train, takes in a lot of sort of data, costs millions, and that's pre-training. And its objective is to just scale the model to help it perform better. Is it performing like a high school student, or is it performing like a university student, or even like a postdoc? So this is what the pre-training gives it. It gives it the raw sort of ability or intelligence, and this is just by virtue of being exposed to a lot of content. Once you've kind of pre-trained it, the model really can't do much. It's still quite gibberish. It's very sort of juvenile in how it goes about kind of doing stuff. And then comes the next phase, which is to kind of make it more aligned. Alignment is quite simple in the sense that it makes it a bit more human-like or more usable, if you may. What do I mean by usable? Being able to chat over a model means that it's usable. The model being able to summarize stuff means that it's more usable. So all these tasks, chatting, summarization, comparing things, is all part of the fine-tuning process. Now, the fine-tuning process does not require a lot of data compared to the pre-training side of things. All it's trying to do is just kind of honing on these abilities. So it needs small amounts of data that are very well curated. And this all requires training. So this is the first part. The next part, as an AI model developer that I need to be thinking about when it comes to data is I've kind of trained the model. I've created my chatbot or whatever, summarization bot or whatever. I go and deploy it out there in public, and I realize, hey, you know what? It's actually hallucinating. And that's when I realized, okay, so it's hallucinating, so I need to give it some sort of context relevant data so that it hallucinates less or kind of does not mitigate against hallucinations. So this is where the whole process about context enrichment comes. The idea being that you give it, you could say, external sources of knowledge or information to kind of work with in addition to what it's already trained on. And we call this context enrichment. One of the techniques that's very widely used out there is something called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. And its core premise is to give models access to external sources of knowledge. For completeness, we also include personalization. Can it work with your personal data? A mix of relevant context of personal relevance of prompts, context relevance of outputs, but it's just an extension of context enrichment. And a lot of times these are used interchangeably, but there is a distinction between the two. So these are the two sort of categories you should be thinking of when it comes to data and its sort of use in AI. But the more important thing is that it's a spectrum. It's not you don't have fine lines between the two. And oftentimes a data set can be used interchangeably. And I'll kind of give you some concrete examples of what that looks like. I'm pretty sure that you must have experienced them as well. But yeah, it is a spectrum. Let's kind of double click on the sort of data for model training sort of segment, which is pre-training and fine-tuning. Now, in this sort of market or the sort of market that has formed, it has a few characteristics. The first one is when it comes to licensing data for model training, it's usually around entire sort of catalogs. It's usually around entire catalogs. If you're a publisher that has any sort of historical archives or sort of a large amount of content, this is inherently a lot more valuable for kind of pre-training and you could say fine-tuning as well. So it's got this sort of element of scale with it. Also, domain specificity has become a bit of has become an increasing factor, especially as now you see with models like Llama 3 being sort of fine-tuned, medical Llama 3, or you could say regulation Llama 3 or finance Llama 3. So domain specificity has become quite important. With this, it needs the sort of domain specific data. But text aside, audio, video, and 3D models are becoming increasingly valuable. Audio, definitely, but there is a sort of key interest in sort of video and 3D models that we're seeing emerge at the moment. You may ask why 3D models? It's because as AI sort of practitioners, if I want to create some sort of generative model on a video, what we usually find is it does not perform well in terms of physics. Now, if I want to get physics in a video, gravity or some sort of physical concept, maybe a car moving or something, I need to train it on 3D model data. And that's the reason why video and 3D models go hand in hand. That's the reason why video companies tend to like 3D model data as well. And what we see is just by virtue of the size and scale of the data sets involved here, most of them are, you could say, one-off or deals based. For example, $60 million a year. That was the Reddit sort of deal, but that was you could say one of the outliers, but they're one-off deals. And you should think of them as one-off deals mainly. A lot of them are structured around this element of being time bound, as a sort of usage bound, increasingly enough, and there is sort of limited revenue sharing within them, or just because of there's no sort of observability within how the data points are going to be used to train a model. So that's the sort of landscape on sort of providing data or licensing data for model training. Some examples include Shutterstock licensing to Apple and OpenAI. I think the reported values have been anywhere between 25 to 50-ish millions of dollars. But like I said, it's fairly sort of large sums that kind of go into this. I think the Shutterstock one was for the few hundred million images as well. So this is fairly large sort of data sets as well. When it comes to data for inference or context, it's slightly different. What we're seeing is that it's very, or rather, it's largely textual, just because of how some of these techniques have evolved. They were text-based techniques, so that's the reason why they've been more textual. And they're often sort of mainly around applications that need grounding information or real-time information, things like the news or some sort of truthful content. So that's one of the sort of defining characteristics of, you could say, context enrichment data. A lot of them, just because of the sort of mechanism by which these work, they've got the attribution factor baked in because RAGs as a technique allows you to do attribution at scale. And because you have attribution, you've got this nice property, because a nice property of being able to allocate revenue, because you can now track or meter which question or which bit of text was used to answer which question or summarize what. So you've got this observability sort of baked into the mechanism. Now, this is increasingly becoming, you could say, um, a much more significant way to license or think about licensing or distribution, especially as answer engines become a lot more sort of prevalent. Perplexity is a good example, but you've got the likes of U.com, etc. But also AI agents as well are increasingly becoming known for wanting access to, you could say, grounding data, real-time data. The bit about AI agents is quite interesting, because when you think about AI agents as opposed to a normal human, if I'm a normal human, well, if I'm a human, I'll probably go and search for a topic or a domain. I may read one or two sort of blogs or articles, whereas an agent, it's a lot more thorough. It's going to go and read 5, 10, 20 articles and then give you an answer. So agents tend to inherently kind of access more information and a lot more content and are just more thorough. So that's the sort of ecosystem in which we're sort of heading, especially as models become more sort of reasoning first or reasoning enabled. Um, but the key sort of limitation or the key sort of distinction in all of this is in the distribution. If you're distributing for inference or context enrichment, you have to start thinking about providing a means to pre-process or index the data so that you can kind of shove these sort of snippets or kind of data sets within context windows. And we'll kind of walk you through what that looks like. A good example of this, like I mentioned, is Perplexity. They did a deal with Yelp on stuff like reviews, and a lot of that has been used to kind of enrich context with, you could say, user feedback or user data or user generated content. Um, like I said, it is a spectrum, and there's a lot of times deals that are kind of in between training and context enrichment. And the best example I can give you is something that you might have already experienced. If you go and ask ChatGPT for the news, especially in the US, it's gonna browse the web. A lot of times it is browsing the web, but in addition to that, it's also going to its data partners and saying, hey, you know what, this person XYZ, they want the news. Can you give the news? They'll get the news, they'll go and summarize it, and what they'll do is provide an attribution. Now, the attribution is very important because some of the deals, the way they're structured is once they provide some sort of context or enrich the context, they provide an attribution with the ability to click over the link, which they can then go and do some sort of referral traffic conversion. So it falls under, you could say, the retrieval augmented generation sort of inference landscape. But the thing about these deals also has been that because you've got the likes of Associated Press and Condé Nast, they've got, you could say, a historical body of content as well. So that also has been used to train some of these models that we're seeing. So it's a bit of both. Another very interesting, or rather non-intuitive example is Reddit, and in my opinion, it's more of a fun sort of example out there in terms of how data is actually used or like data is actually used and licensed as well. Um, it's down to part of it's being used to fine tune models, but also for context enrichment. If you have ever asked ChatGPT or any of these sort of models, hey, you know what, explain some concept to me like I'm 5 years old, the reason why it can do this is because it's been trained on a data set much like the explain like I'm five data set. So you've got a topic and then you've got a bunch of people explaining that concept. And it's the ability for this model to learn is and respond in that manner is because of being trained on data sets like this. So that there's definitely that's a value, but there's also you could say the context enrichment value, the grounding value out there. as a software engineer, I often find myself kind of going to the R software engineering sort of subreddit to see interesting sort of engineering practices or some sort of solutions or something. So if I ever need sort of that real-time grounding, I've always kind of resorted to this. And this is where the stuff around RAG and context enrichment has fallen in place. Same thing with things like product review, personal finance, etc. So it all boils down to how you see your data used in which sort of area of the spectrum and what that means. Obviously, with that in mind, how you do the valuation of a data set really differs, and oftentimes you don't know where to begin. But what we realized is if you start thinking of it in terms of these two aspects, it should give you some level of understanding, or at least help you ask the right questions when it comes to understanding the value of data. The first one is the apparent value, and the second one is the latent value of your data set. When it comes to apparent value, it's more objective. Think of it as properties that just make your data set better. Things like if it's an image, is it blurry? Is it not blurry? How useful is it to train a model? Essentially, the question you have to ask yourself is, in my data, how good are my individual data points? If I've got newspaper articles, are they just a bunch of, you could say, photos of newspapers, or are there actual text-based news examples? That just helps an ML sort of engineer train models quicker. Um, and there's a bunch of things you should be thinking about when it comes to this. How consistent is it? How many samples or representative samples it is? Um, does it have the right sort of documentation? Because documentation is important for an AI sort of engineer or an ML engineer. Just knowing what this data set consists of helps them be a lot more informed about what they're going to be using it for, or where exactly they're going to use it to train the model. Increasingly enough provenance, or having at least a good sort of record of how the data has been, you could say, collected or kind of curated, if it's been labeled or not labeled, really, really do sort of amplify, you could say, the apparent value. And just to give you a good indication of what this actually means, we actually did we did a lot of valuation or sort of benchmarking on some of these data sets, just so that you can understand this better. So one of them is Shutterstock. So we work with Shutterstock, and what we did was we took their sort of high quality data and we benchmarked it against a sort of a Hugging Face web data available sort of data set. And what we realized is in our benchmarking, the mean score of the Hugging Face data set is hovering about 2.5-ish. The Shutterstock one, just because of by virtue of how well it's curated, all the documentation, etc., around it, hovers around 5.5-ish. Now, if I'm an ML or AI engineer, for me, if I'm spending millions on training a model, I know that there's only a limiting or a certain threshold of performance that I'll get when I train it on this data as opposed to this data. So these are all the questions I, as an ML sort of engineer, I'm thinking of in terms of what's the upper bound I can get when it comes to performance when I train this model. So that's the reason why things like apparent value are really significant and oftentimes underlooked. But I'd really encourage you to really think about your data set and these sorts of metrics as well in terms of quality. The next part is the more sort of interesting, but also subjective element, which is what is the potential of my data set to an AI model or an application? Now, like I said, it's a very subjective thing, but what we really kind of encourage people to do is think of it in terms of these categories that we discussed previously. So, you've got your pre-training, fine-tuning, and RAG ones. Now, when it comes to pre-training, if your data set has topical breadth, that's good. If it's got more sort of reasoning or logic-based stuff, that's even better. The reasoning bit is very interesting because when we see models being trained currently, what most of research labs want is the ability to kind of allow them to reason. Now, the ability to reason is based on it being trained on a lot more code-based examples of programming data. and you could say scientific papers, etc. So that's one of the reasons why you could say that pre-training data and is quite necessary here. The next bit is fine tuning. So if you've got task-oriented data, do I have does my data set allow you to carry out a certain task? Is it a research task? If that's the case, or if is it a summarization task, then it does fall under the fine-tuning space. Again, having multiple domains is really good as well because alignment falls under this category as well. Then there is obviously the factual grounding one, where if it's sort of news or any other sort of hardcore scientific facts, it lends itself very well to being used for things like context enrichment. So you should be kind of thinking about it in these three buckets. And the crucial thing is the influence each data point has across all these three sort of categories. As you go down, a data point will become more and more significant and influence. That means it commands a higher value. Um, and the other aspect is how this kind of reflects on the pricing as well. A lot of times, as I said, it's more sort of deals based, but there's also usage based pricing as you go down towards the RAG based stuff, just because of how much an individual data point commands. Um, which sort of brings me to the last bit is how do you actually improve the value of your data set when it comes to the repackaging and distribution? Ideally, what you want to do is curate it or kind of at least improve and repackage it so that it's got a higher quality, and then think about kind of multiple distribution channels. Is it just for pre-training? Is it for RAG, or what does that look like? Um, this is more to drive up the sort of apparent value, if you may, and this you could say increases its ability to kind of cater for multiple, you could say, latent value segments. Repackaging, for example, in our case for images, we do a lot of things at Valyu. If you've got your image data, we kind of look into the file types, the encodings, the resolutions. Then we look into things like what the quality is. Again, we've got our own sort of personal benchmarks here. What's the aesthetic quality of the image? If it's labeled, what does that look like? Does it have a watermark? If not, what does that look like as well? Or watermark, or even things like, copyright labels as well. If there's a person wearing a copyright T-shirt in the image. So these are also significant. Then there is also the semantics of this. What exactly is this image about? Is it image about a dog? Is it an image about a dog playing with a ball? Or having that level of detail is great. Then comes the bias and toxicity stuff. Is this a biased image? Is it reflecting some sort of sort of toxic content or NSFW content? Does it have private information, things like car plate numbers, etc.? Is it part of a corpus that was initially poisoned as well? So these are some of the things that we kind of help you kind of do. But the key thing over here is if you can do some sort of simple pre-processing, it will put you leaps and bounds better to negotiate better. Think of it this way. If I'm an AI developer, I know 80 or 90% of my work is just going to be pre-processing. If you can make it easier, I can ship models a lot more quicker. So for me, it's in my interest to kind of acquire high quality data. And this kind of helps me significantly. The other bit when you should be thinking about is how you think about distribution. So, okay, now you've got this well, nice curated sort of data set, which is your content. Are you giving it for training? Then you have to start thinking about how to go about transferring it. Do I have the infrastructure to do it? Again, it might seem very trivial, but it's not a trivial problem, especially if you're working with arguably tens and hundreds of terabytes of data when it comes to things like images. It becomes a very expensive problem. So you should be thinking about what are the means and mechanisms to do this. Then there is RAGs. So RAGs, the downside with RAGs is you have to kind of index or build your indexes, or kind of rely on someone else to build the indexes, or kind of do it in a cost-effective way. So there's definitely that. Another sort of increasing way most people are doing it is through something called crawl-friendly indexing. Can I have a third party just run the crawler and index it on my behalf? What does that look like? But ultimately, we encourage you to control your own distribution. and you want to be able to control it. You want to be able to control it, which kind of brings me to the second last part of this webinar, which is opting in or opting out. Now, there is no clear consensus about which is the right way to do it. Again, it's a very sort of nascent ecosystem, and it really depends on the kind of data, what industry you are in, and what sort of regulations that you might be exposed to. What I mean by kind is simple things like whether it's proprietary data or whether it's publicly available data, that will impact on whether opt-in is the best mechanism or opt-out is the best mechanism. Then there's also, you could say, industry-based sort of ways to do things, and audio is arguably one of the best examples here of music. When it comes to music, it's more of a, you could say, push-based mechanism where a lot of times it's more of an opt-in mechanism, whereas for other industries, especially for things like code and programming, it's been more sort of it's got this historical element of opt-out already in it. Then comes the regulation as well. Again, copyright regulation, the way we see it, is more sort of push-based, whereas you could say AI regulation, again, EU AI Act talks a lot about opt-out. That's more sort of pull-based. Again, there is no right way. It depends on the application or what exactly is the it really depends. But one key sort of thread across all this is that you need to be able to do some form of bookkeeping, even before you think about enforcing these. And bookkeeping is a very sort of challenging task. Whether you kind of think of it in the additive way or the subtractive way, you do need bookkeeping, i.e. opt-in, opt-out, additive, subtractive. And ultimately, you do need mechanisms and tooling. And the question you should be asking yourself is, what mechanisms or tooling do I or my users have to kind of enable this? How do I go about thinking about this? Now, the whole bit about opt-in, opt-out is definitely going to be part of the next sort of webinar we kind of talk about, we kind of think of. And that part also has a large element to do with sort of crawling and robots and how to go about kind of doing that sort of managing bot traffic and analytics. So I'll kind of leave the discussion here, but we'll be taking that in the next sort of part. The last bit I want to kind of just highlight a bit more is some of the compensation models out there. You've got the direct ones. These are usually between AI developers, mainly foundational model companies, and large scale sort of rights holders or content platforms. Most of them have been deals based with a cash component. But as we go along, increasingly, there's been more of a benefit in kind. Can you use can you use a GPT for your clients for your company, or can you kind of use I don't know, X amount of OpenAI credits for your models internally, etc. So there's some sort of benefit in kind that's being structured with these direct sort of licensing deals. The other one has again, being aggregation and pooling. In my opinion, this is still very much in the realms of theory. We've seen some elements of it being used in the real world, but still very sort of nascent, which is between AI developers and, you could say, individuals coming together and providing their data or consent to AI companies or developers. So that's the whole aggregation and pooling element of it. Then there is the attributions based, which in my opinion is the most interesting and I think the most significant, which is can I kind of be compensated in some sort of proportion based on how much my sort of initial input of a data set has kind of contributed towards a given output. Now, from a machine learning perspective, this is a very difficult thing to do, but you are seeing some tools and some methods, especially in research, that are sort of pushing for this. The other one, which we kind of saw, was the political one, where there's some preferred placements or click-throughs that you can go and monetize as well. And I think within this sort of ecosystem, there's a lot of arguments where people are saying data for AI or data marketplaces, or call it whatever you may, they are evolving almost similar to how ad networks and ad markets evolved as well. So just something to kind of think about, especially with things like attribution. And for completeness, there's the whole ad supported element that's coming along. Things like if I've placed this content in the context window, can I supplement the keyword with an ad placement or a sponsored placement? I'll give you a good example, somewhat of a theoretical example for this. So let's say I've got an answer engine and I ask it, hey, you know what? Give me a good recipe of an exotic pizza. Assuming that the answer engine has never been trained on this exotic pizza recipe, it's going to go and find it from a content provider. The content provider will provide the recipe, but then wherever there's the keyword mozzarella, it might go and say, hey, you know what? Replace the word mozzarella with Value's finest Italian mozzarella cheese or something like that. So you've got that inline sort of placement of ads. That way you've got someone paying for this. There's a lot of motivations for this because in a lot of cases, the unit economics of providing data or data monetization actually scales better with ads more than the other models, especially for context enrichment. So that's why there's a lot of, you could say, motivation for having sort of ad supported models out there as well. And we're seeing some elements of this, especially with Perplexity thinking about sponsored placements as well. And yeah, so that sort of completes this sort of webinar, and I think we've got some time, so I'll briefly kind of go through a couple of questions and then we can conclude. Cheers. Do we have any questions? I think I'll give it a couple of minutes. So the question is, would you say that the preferred compensation models for rights holders, what is the preferred compensation models for rights holders in terms of viability? Um, that it's a there is a current sort of model, and there's a model that we are recommending rights holders to think about. The current model is mainly one of, hey, you know what, you provide us your data. It's one of sort of licensing deals, and we can do whatever we want. The bit that we are encouraging is think about it more in terms of something that's more recurring. So goes down the sort of RAG or context enrichment stuff. We are kind of you kind of being compensated per use of your content. Ultimately, like I said, we see this as a new sort of way to sort of monetize or kind of distribute your content, and it should be in line with how much your content is consumed, rather than having these one-off deals, and that just kind of give you a one-off sort of revenue stream rather than something that's more recurring. There's a nice sort of bit that we also mentioned to some sort of publishers and rights holders is think of it slightly differently as well. The way we're heading, especially with generative AI, is quite different. It's because I, as a consumer, might choose to consume a blog post either as text or as a podcast. That's entirely up to me. So how I go about doing the licensing should definitely reflect that. So that's something we do recommend is do something that's deal based, but also kind of push more towards some sort of revenue sharing, or at least some sort of RAG based revenue sharing, if you can. Obviously, that comes with its own sort of complexities around metering and analytics and kind of analyzing what's being used and content serving, but we can help you with that. Got another question. Can you explain a bit more about indexing data for RAGs? Does this mean encoding metadata so that it can be retrieved faster? Okay, so indexing for RAG is essentially you've got your data set, and what you're doing is taking this data set, you're processing it, and you're kind of putting it in something called a vector database. Now, a vector it's essentially a format that these models can understand. So you've taken this, you've kind of put it in a format that these models can understand. Now, as a model, I'm just going and kind of accessing this information here. Again, it's a very sort of generalized, you could say, explanation, but think of it just as a format for your models to kind of access. Um, I can go into a lot more detail about how it works, or the sort of I can nerd swipe a lot here, but I'll refrain from doing that. Feel free to drop me a message and email, and I'll walk you through how it's done. Yeah. Yeah. I think we've got one more question, and yeah, one more question. Just bear with me. I'm just going to read through it. Okay. So the question is around. So I'm going to just summarize what the question is. Um, so you've got multiple sort of data sets or data points within a data set influencing a model. And the question when it comes to data acquisition is you want to ask is whether a particular data set is contributing enough to make it worth paying for or kind of renewing licenses. Um, so in terms of how to go about thinking about this, I'd again kind of default to the sort of framework that we kind of talked about is which is the pre-training, fine-tuning, and the RAG-based stuff. On the RAG-based stuff, it's very easy to understand this particular data set actually provided this much value. You can easily meter it and kind of understand how it works. On the training side of things is where things get a bit more, you could say, difficult to meter. Um, but the way things are headed is that these foundational models are increasingly being used on, you could say, reasoning-based data sets or code-based data sets. So I think understanding what comes in a training syllabus will help you kind of understand why it's important or what sort of bits of that data set are important and are contributing to the performance of a model. Um, there is a much more technical answer to this as well is do an ablation study. Now, an ablation study is pretty much training a very small model on a data set to understand how much quality is there, what's the noise to signal ratio in that data before you kind of go and train a much bigger model. That at the moment is the go-to technique used by, you could say, OpenAI or everyone to kind of understand the, you could say, the value of a data set, train a small model, see how well it performs. That will kind of help you generalize to a much larger model. Right. So I think this does conclude the sort of webinar. I appreciate you all kind of taking the time this Tuesday afternoon to kind of for this webinar. We will be, excuse me, we will be sharing a screen share of this of this webinar on our sort of YouTube channels. But the intention is to kind of create a multi-part series to go into a lot more detail in each of these themes. And the way we like to position Valyu is we do a lot of technical work in each of these domains and would love to understand from you which bits you guys are more interested in so we can kind of cater this webinar series to kind of answer those questions. And with that, the next one will talk a lot more about opt-in, opt-out, and sort of bot traffic and bot analytics and how to go about thinking about those in a lot more detail. Appreciate you all coming. Have a sort of a good afternoon or yeah, cheers. Thank you. Bye.